It's 2016, and while cruising YouTube, I stumbled across this gem of a video by famous sword tuber Skallagrim. And immediately I was intrigued and entranced by the sword that he was showing, the Albion Connect. Just looking at that sword, I didn't believe that there was something so katana-like, and thus begun my obsession with the war knife. Now, at that time, I was primarily studying Japanese martial arts, specifically Kenjutsu, so the shape of the Kriegsmesser was very alluring to me. It was very katana-like, and it really propelled me into the world of HEMA because at that point, I didn't know swords like that existed. Now, throughout the years, I started studying more longsword. I got into langmesser later on, and later on as well, saber. But I've always come back to the allure of the war knife. Now, unlike longsword and messer and saber and all these other sword systems that I ended up coming in contact with, when I looked up existing manuscripts for how to learn how to use a Kriegsmesser, none were found. To my dismay, there are none in existence that we know of. The best we have are references from books and some period artwork. And trust me, I scoured the internet looking for source material or anyone that has experience with fighting with weapons like the Kriegsmesser. Now, studying German longsword for about 12 years has shown me a few things about the possibilities of fighting with the Kriegsmesser. In the experiments that I have done using longsword techniques against longsword fighters, they don't work the same way. Every single time I try to use a Kriegsmesser like a longsword against a longsword fighter, I get beaten very soundly. And I'm coming to the conclusion that trying to use the Kriegsmesser like a longsword just kind of doesn't work. My sparring Kriegsmesser, the VB war knife from Purple Heart Armory, is shorter than a typical fetter, so it's going to have a reach disadvantage. It's also quite forward heavy compared to a fetter. And I do think that that is by design. I think war knives definitely are supposed to be a lot choppier than a longsword, primarily for cutting, but still able to be used in the thrust. This example from Bellower Arms has a sharpened back edge, and so does my Pavel Mach. I can tell that this is still an okay thruster, but it's not optimized for that, but it is a really good slasher. Whenever I've gone online to forums to look up if people have done experimentation and posted it, made it public, the most common response I get is that you should just use it like a longsword. In some other cases, I've seen people talk about using them more like a normal size langmesser. From my experience and just my general theory, I believe that there is some truth to both of these. But using a Kriegsmesser like it's a longsword or a langmesser by itself, I think doesn't really merit what the sword is actually capable of, or maybe what it was used for. In the past few months, I've taken it upon myself to understand this weapon a lot more, and not only to spar with it and discover what it's capable of against your standard HEMA weapons, such as a rapier, such as an arming sword or a longsword, and even a langmesser. But I really want to discover if there is anything special to this sword at all, if there are specific techniques that are unique to it, or if it's just an adaptable weapon to existing manuscripts. Maybe that's why there's no existing manuscripts that we know of. Maybe it just wasn't popular enough as a weapon, and it was just assumed that you would use your existing skills from a longsword or a langmesser already. It could be that there's a manuscript somewhere out there that teaches the use of a two-handed falchion or a Kriegsmesser, but it's lost and we haven't found it yet. But until that day comes that we discover that dusty old text and we release it to the world, I want to learn how to fight with this weapon now. Now, my experience with historical sword martial arts comes from a good combination that represents this sword. I have my experience with German longsword, with the langmesser, with saber, and with Japanese swordsmanship. And I think that there's applicable knowledge from all of these that I could figure out how to use this weapon, but I also don't want to stray so far from historical examples of how this was used or historical context and just make up my own thing. The problem is there's nothing for me to reference except for artwork. Ultimately, why I'm making this video, I think, is to recreate something that might be plausible with this historical weapon. To maybe make a guide of best practices, while not historical, maybe historically inspired. Something that is easily usable for the HEMA practitioner and also enjoyable for somebody who just enjoys knowing how something like this worked. I still think that the Kriegsmesser is such an alluring blade. The shape of it, the combination of different elements from different cultures from what it looks like. And I don't know, it's just unique compared to what we see in HEMA today with everybody using a longsword, everybody using a saber, everybody using a dusak or messer. There's something so brutal about this weapon, but it's also really elegant. And while we could just assume that if you understand how to use a messer and a longsword, you should be able to use a Kriegsmesser, I really do believe that there is a special middle ground that this sword could occupy. I also could be completely wrong, and the information is already out there, and someone has already tried this and found that it was nothing special. Either way, I think the experimental archaeology would be very interesting and very fun. And so my goal for this is to make a multi-video series reconstructing how someone plausibly would fight with a Kriegsmesser. I want to do this through a combination of metrics. Number one, I want to understand the context behind Kriegsmessers a bit more, and to do that, I'm going to have to talk to some experts. I'll get to that in a second. Secondly, I need some anecdotal evidence of my own. I need to be sparring with this and fighting different weapons and fighting weapons like it. And even as an instructor, I wouldn't say that I'm the authority on German sword fighting, but I think it would be very useful to talk to a lot of different experts who might be able to give me insight on who used this weapon, why it was used, and how it could have been used in the context of that time. I need to know firsthand experience on how this weapon handles so I can come up with these techniques and then pass it on to other people and see if it works for them, and basically find out through attrition if a technique is useful or not. I do believe using existing systems such as Lecküchner and Lichtenauer would greatly influence my opinion on how this weapon was most likely used. In the past few months, I have been sparring with my Kriegsmesser to figure a lot of these things out already, and I'm still stumped on a lot of how the weapon should be used. There was a lot of illumination that happened with that. I truly thought that I could just use it as a longsword or a really long messer, and every single time that happened, I would get hit. But there were a few techniques that I found worked with pretty much every opponent that I fought, and I'm wondering if there is some historical plausibility to those techniques. I'm going to list those in a later video. I would love to make a multi-video series on this to discover how this weapon was most likely used. Now, when it comes to consulting experts, I would love to talk to specifically 3 people. The first person that comes to mind is Oscar from Virtual Effectual, who has been a huge influence in our students and even myself for Messer. The second would be Adam Bodericks, the owner of Landsknecht Emporium. In my opinion, Landsknecht Emporium is one of the authorities on reproduction of historically correct messers. They make a Kriegsmesser as well, the Rotmilan, which has reviews on the internet currently. But I believe that Adam probably has a lot of understanding of the context of how these were used. Last but not least, I would love to have a conversation with James Elmsley, the person who created the Elmsley typology that we use to categorize falchions and messers to this day. If there's anyone else you think that I should be talking to, or maybe you're that person I should be talking to, please post that in the comments. I want to reach out to them, set up some interviews, and really go into detail of how this weapon was used. I think a lot of people would be intrigued with it, and I would love to put some practical knowledge behind it. Maybe even create some form of a modern manuscript, a modern manual that people could use if they end up deciding to purchase a HEMA safe sparring version of a Kriegsmesser. I mean, there's just nothing like owning a sword like this and knowing the history and the techniques that are used with it. I think it's just very cool. I'm a distilled learner, so I really enjoy finding how things work and putting them into a way that everyone can understand. That it's easy, it's instinctual, that can be used under pressure in sparring with a helmet on, with gloves, all of those things. But I also want to understand how this weapon was used historically, hence the H in HEMA. This is not going to replace any academic research that has already been done on this sword or will be done in the future. I'm not stating that I want to make a manuscript that is seen as gospel or seen as history. It is just a modern interpretation of how a HEMA practitioner could use a weapon like this that has historical plausibility, a little bit of historical backing maybe. But at the same time, maybe we are overthinking this and there isn't a whole lot to this weapon at all. But I don't believe that. I think it's going to be a fun journey. Anyways, guys, that's all I got for today. This is, I think, a really fun project that is going to take a lot of research and work to make happen. Why don't you tell me in the comments what you guys think, and we'll go from there. Should I contact these people? Should I make a second video on this? Let me know.